All right. Well, for anyone who's watching the recording, welcome to the workshop. This is another SkillSpire workshop to introduce sort of the idea of full stack web development, kind of go over what we teach, do a little sort of technical workshop ourselves, and talk about React, talk about how React plays into all of this. What is React? Why is it important? All that jazz. Okay. So I think this takes over the entire two monitors. Anyways, okay. So what is React and full stack web development? We're going to talk about kind of what full stack web development is really referring to in just a second. But before we do that, again, just to give you a quick intro on myself, my name is Samia. I'm an instructor at SkillSpire, and I also work in the industry. So I'm a project engineer at a biotech company called Lifespan Bio. And a project engineer is sort of, you can think of it as half project manager, half software engineer, because those are kind of the two biggest components of my work. I work with a lot of people. I manage a lot of different projects and assign a lot of work across a couple different departments, and I get to do coding as well. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds for me. So why break into tech? Obviously, all of you guys are here because you are interested in sort of what this industry has to offer. But I don't know about you guys, but at least for me, when I attended an info session on coding boot camps, I went to a different one. But I was just kind of curious. I didn't really know what I was getting into. I just kind of wandered in, like, I hear coding is really the next big thing, but I don't know anything about it. And I didn't necessarily have the intention of sort of pivoting my entire career, which is really what ended up happening. But I was just kind of curious about it. So, why break into tech? Why break into this industry? For a number of reasons. It is a industry filled with challenging, creative, and meaningful work. This is an industry that is sort of at the precipice of research and development and innovation. It's absolutely filled with creative and collaborative energy. There's really so many directions that you can go in. It's challenging. It's not an easy industry to break into, but it's incredibly sort of gratifying in that way when you do accomplish something and when you do contribute to these big projects. It feels really good. There's a lot of meaningful work. You can kind of end up wherever. Speaking to the variety of work point, because everybody needs tech is the reality of it. The reality of the tech world is that it is just sort of taking over in the sense that technology is being so completely intertwined in our lives. It already kind of is, with everything from social media to just, if you're running a business, you need to have a website, and it's so heavily integrated in so many aspects of our lives. And it's like we're on an exponential graph here, right? Of how tech is sort of affecting all of our lives. And right now we're like at the upswing, but it's going to go like this. And pretty soon, as more time passes, it's just going to be more and more heavily integrated into our lives. So for me, at least, when I got into tech and when I got into coding, I should say, when I learned more seriously web development, I actually did not intend on pivoting my entire career. It wasn't really what I planned to do, for me at least. I wanted to learn coding because I knew how essential it was. There's this idea that computer literacy is going to become the new literacy. So right now, if you don't know how to read and write, and if you don't have, a high school, sometimes even college degree, that can really hurt. But I think things are changing now. It's not really about the degree. It's about what you can do and what you understand and what you're able to learn. And tech, at least, is just going to become even more integrated than it already is. The way that we grew up learning math and science and reading and writing, our children, the generations after us, are going to grow up coding. They're going to understand hardware and software alongside with all of those other sort of, historic elements that we always grew up learning. So things are changing pretty rapidly. And for me, at least, there was a sense of, I don't want to get left behind. I want to understand all of this because I think it's important. So that's at least why I joined. The variety of work, every industry needs tech. So whether you're interested in interior design or fashion or music or, science, in my case, I was a bio major. I was working in a research lab. I was studying HIV. I was on a very different track, but I needed to know some minor amount of programming for my work. And that kind of kickstarted me into it. And now I work in a biotech field and I get to use my biological sciences background. I still get to work with science and I still have to understand the science of antibodies and proteins and all the research reagents that we create. But I'm much more on the tech side of things now. So for me, it was like the marriage of my two great passions. And that's what it is for a lot of people. You can really get into any industry that you want outside of just the tech industry. Of course, you can work for companies like Microsoft and Amazon and all these these pure tech companies. But you can also work for another industry that just needs tech because every industry needs tech. High demand, high pay. That's one of the biggest draws for most people. You can work pretty much anywhere. You have amazing job security. Especially in the pandemic, that was critical. I was one of the, I felt really, really lucky that I could immediately work remote. I didn't have to worry about going into the office and exposing myself and my family. And even when there were like rounds of layoffs happening at my work, which there was, and it was kind of scary, there was also sort of this comforting feeling of like, well, I'll be fine. I live in Seattle. I live in a tech bubble. / everyone needs, programmers. Everyone needs PMs. So I'll be okay. And just that sense of job security was really, really big. High demand equals high pay, right? These are not easy skills to acquire. Anyone can learn. Anyone can learn how to code. I really, really believe that. If you can learn how to read and write, if you can learn basic math, you can learn how to code. But not everyone does. It's not easy, right? You see a lot of people graduating from, colleges and boot camps and everything, but it's still a competitive industry. And it's not, there's a learning curve, absolutely, to it. Some of you already have experience in the development world, but if you don't, you'll quickly find that it does have a pretty intense learning curve. That being said, anyone can learn. Like I believe that to my core, that anyone can learn how to code. Just not everyone does. So if you're already here and you're interested, you're already a few steps ahead of the game. I originally had all these like stats and everything, but presumably you're here because you're interested in this. But the median pay for someone who's working in IT, I think nationally is like 90,000. If you're somewhere like on the West Coast, that jumps up, right? Especially Washington or California. So it's more like in the 110K range for the median, like the middle level salary. Just think about like how much it goes up from there, right? So definitely that security is a big draw. But don't forget the work itself is also just incredibly interesting and meaningful and very exciting and creative. You get to use that creative energy. So that brings us to our next question. Why boot camp, right? A lot of people say, should I go back to college? Or can I just learn on my own? Why can't I watch some YouTube courses and learn? And you can. You absolutely can. That's where I started. I was watching YouTube videos. I was taking online courses. And I was playing around with that for like 2 years, not really seriously learning, making some progress. I took a Georgia Tech University course in Python. Like I was teaching myself, but it's a little hard to sort of stay on your own case about completing your assignments and getting through a program when there's nothing really holding you accountable, right? It's not like I wasn't in college at that point, so I didn't have to complete it. It requires a lot of self-motivation. And I consider myself a decently self-motivated individual. So joining something like a boot camp gives you a clear syllabus. It gives you a clear structure. It allows you to learn much, much faster than you would on your own. Oh my goodness. Boot camps move fast. We're trying to cram a lot into a short amount of time, right? You're competing with people graduating from 4-year degrees. or from full-time boot camps. I happen to attend a full-time boot camp, but each of these boot camps, full-time, part-time, whatever, you are taking the most essential practical components of a CS degree and condensing them into a 4-month track to give you the most essential skills so that you can come out and at the end of it, you can bang out a website, you know? And that's really what it is, about practical skill development so that you are ready for the industry. It's about preparedness for the industry. So understanding the interview process, understanding networking, understanding resume building and where to apply and how to apply, and getting you letters of rec and all kinds of things. But it crams a lot into a short period of time. But, you know, when I joined my boot camp, I learned in a day about Python what my online course taught me in 6 months. And then the next 6 months of that online course were crammed into the next 2 days of the boot camp. And it really, really was. I mean, they condensed so much. We condensed so much. And that's just how it is because you're here for a short amount of time and there's a lot to learn, right? So it is fast, it is structured, and it gets you there in a much shorter amount of time. And much more affordable, right? You can go back and get a 4-year degree if you want, if you can, but not everyone has that kind of money. Not everyone has that kind of time, right? People decide they need a change in their career. They don't want to wait 4 years. I didn't want to when I did make this decision. 4 months, that's all it took. You know, add another month for interviewing and, actually getting a job. But that was it. In less than half a year, I had completely pivoted my career and I had upped my salary by a significant percentage. I had more than doubled it compared to the industry I was in, which I loved. I loved the industry I was in and I still think it's fascinating. But I was also making, $15 an hour as a lab researcher. It's very different when you're working as a programmer. So boot camps are a much more affordable way to kind of break into this industry. Your instructors are all industry professionals. We are trained to teach. We are passionate about the work that we do. We are passionate about coding, and we are very much invested in getting you guys into this new career track and really helping you with that and really being a resource for you. Certification also helps. You can be self-taught, but when you don't have any industry experience or very limited industry experience, having some sort of certification under your belt does give you a leg up. It's just another thing to kind of stamp on the resume and say, hey, look, I did this. I can prove to you that I'm committed and I know what I'm doing because, look, I have this certified institute saying that I'm a full stack web developer. So that definitely helps. And it helps you build your network. I'll let you know right now, the single greatest thing I got out of my boot camp really was the working alongside my peers, the collaborating and, working with the people that were in my boot camp. We learned so much from each other. We all came from completely different industries and brought very different strengths to the table. And that was the biggest difference between kind of working on my own versus, going in and actually having, this set environment that I was in. For 4 months, alongside 25 other people, I, lived, breathed, and ate code. Like that was it. That's all I was doing for 4 months. It took a serious amount of dedication. We were all in the same boat. For me, that was a few years ago. And I'm still good friends with not all of them, but with a lot of them. Like those are still some of my best friends. I still get together with them. We still collaborate on projects together. A lot of people ended up working together. They end up being really good professional connections also. So it's not just the friendships, but it's like what you're learning from each other and what you can kind of like give to each other later, down the line. I've written letters of rec for some of my friends to help them get jobs. So it's just a really great way to sort of expand this network and just take your learning to another level. So I'm going to get a little bit into the nitty and gritty of kind of what we're going to be learning. We're going to do our own technical workshop. Before we do that, you need your text editors. So I'll talk about what a text editor is if you don't already know and kind of why we want to use these. But if you have not already, download these. If you haven't downloaded any of them, at least pick one. They all essentially do the same thing. They all allow you to write, save, and manipulate code. But a text editor is quite literally just somewhere that you can edit text. And from there, you'll actually be able to run these programs. But Notepad is technically a text editor. It's a terrible one, so don't use it. But Notepad, Notepad++ are both technically also text editors. These just are a little bit fancier. They allow us to do a little bit more. So the reason I like to bring this up now is because theoretically, you either already have it downloaded, or if you don't, you can kick off the download now. By the time we get to the coding portion, this should totally be ramped up. If you're on a Mac, the downloads are very straightforward. It's like click of a button. If you're on a Windows, I think you just have to know if you're 32-bit versus 64-bit, which you can find in the about sort of software section from the start menu. If you have questions, let me know. If you're typing questions into the chat, I can't see them because this bloody PowerPoint takes over both my screens. So if you do have a question, unmute yourself, shout it out. I will not be offended. Just speak up. So yeah, if you're having any trouble with your download or anything, just let me know. But it should be pretty straightforward. So moving right along, the World Wide Web. I like to start with this. I like to talk about kind of what is the internet, how does this work, why do we care, kind of topic, because it was one of the first things I learned in my boot camp. Of course, this is a sort of cursory overview. We're not exactly getting into the nuts and bolts of everything about how the internet works. But I remember when I joined, it was one of the first questions that we were asked, like, do you know how the internet actually works? And it sounds like such a funny question. Like, it's like this massive thing that sort of like runs our whole worlds, our little worlds. But do we actually know how it works? I'll tell you right now, I didn't. I really didn't when I first joined. I was like, I don't know, cloud in the sky. Like, I know theoretically it's not a literal cloud in the literal sky, but everyone calls it the cloud, and I don't really know what it is. And my instructor was like, I hate that they called it the cloud because it gives this impression that it's this like giant floating thing or something. Yes, it is sort of like this, lasting forever sort of feeling, I guess, but that clouds provide, I don't know. Anyways, it's not a giant thing in the sky. Really, it's just a global network of computers that can all communicate with each other. Like at its core, that's what the internet is, right? Everything that you do on the internet, whether it's logging on to Facebook or searching something on Google or sending an email, all of this is done by a series of interconnected servers. And when I say server, I'm really saying computer, right? Like the machine that you're on, the laptop that I'm on right now, it has its own small server, right? It's much smaller. It's about yay big compared to if you have a desktop, or if you remember having a desktop once upon a time, you had that sort of like CPU, right? That's a server. And if you can imagine, there are just warehouses, huge, massive warehouses filled with these computers, with these servers. And all of these servers are able to communicate with each other through a variety of means. You've got, radio signals, you've got computer network signals, you've got fiber optic cables running underground. But one way or another, these guys are able to communicate with each other. The web is made of what we call clients and servers. When you do sort of get into learning more about web development, you'll hear a lot about a request response cycle. That's something we refer to a lot, the request response cycle. The request is being made by the client. But when I say client, I'm not referring to like you, physically the person, or like me. I'm not a client. But the portal that I'm using to connect to the internet and to actually access like different applications, that's the client. So I would say it's not my laptop, right? But it's like a web browser. So if I hop into Google Chrome and I type in Amazon.com, Google Chrome is the client. Google Chrome is making a request and accessing a server and saying, hey, I want to see this website. And that's the request that's getting sent out, right? there is then a response that comes back in the form of a web page generally, or a 404 not found message if I didn't type the URL correctly, or a 400 error message, sorry, something broke, something went wrong, or a 410, hey, you know, this thing doesn't exist, or you're in China and you get a, sorry, you're not allowed to access this website page, right? Like you're going to get some sort of a response back. Ideally, it's the actual website you were trying to access. So that's the request response cycle, a request made by the client, usually a web browser, and a response handed back from a server somewhere far, far away that has stored all of this information, has stored the web page, the applications, the security, right? So it will know who you are based on your IP address and decide if you are allowed to have access to this, right? When you think about like, if you've ever logged on to Netflix from a different part of the world, right, you'll suddenly see that different things are accessible, right? I was traveling to South Africa for a conference, super cool, on the plane ride. And when I was there, I was like binging Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. So it's a great show. Got halfway through the season, came here, and it was like, your country doesn't have this. And I was like, what the hell? Because my IP address had changed. And, you know, you can do all kinds of fun things like set up a proxy and trick it into thinking you're coming from South Africa when you're coming from here. Although devices have gotten smarter and Netflix now tries to block you when you do that. But that's like a request response cycle that's coming from a different area, right? So it's still assessing like who you are, where you're from, and what you should have the right to access. So anyways, that's sort of a brief summary on the internet. To get into a slightly more detail, how is this actually happening? So, and we'll kind of breeze through this, but your browser makes a request, right? So I type in www.amazonprime.com because I want to get access to all the cool, I don't know, things. And it searches through what's called the DNS, or the domain name server, which is like, it's like a giant yellow book of URLs, right? The yellow pages. I don't know if anyone actually remembers what the yellow pages are. Slash, if you didn't grow up in America, that probably doesn't make any sense. But like a giant directory, basically, of like yellow pages would be like, you know, here's Samia Ahmed, and this is the street address she lives on. Like, which in retrospect is sort of an odd breach in security, but you can also look at businesses and everything. The DNS is like that, but for web pages. So it'll match up the IP address and say, okay, well, this person put in this URL, amazon.com/prime. This URL is paired with this IP address. Okay, that IP address tells me like where in this series of global network of servers this particular application lives on. I'm going to connect her to that. I'm going to connect this client to that. So the browser sends an HTTP request to that server saying, hey, can you send me back a copy of your website? The server then has to approve that request, right? It has to say, yep, this person does in fact have access. Yes, they do live in an area that has access to this. No, they don't have some security settings saying that they can't. No, our website is not blocked. Okay. And then it will send back the website, but it sends back the website in a series of data packets. And we're going to talk about what those data packets are. Your browser receives the data packets, reassembles them into a website, displays it on your lovely homepage, and all of this happens in like 0.2 seconds, right? Back in the day when you had dial-up, there was more of a process, right? You would actually hear the dial-up. I don't know if you guys remember this. I'm sort of shocked I do because I was a kid, but I remember in the 90s, you had to like wind up the internet almost is what it felt like. There was like a process of it sort of making this request response cycle and completing the cycle. And then someone would run the microwave or something and it would like disrupt the signal. Obviously now everyone's on high speed and this isn't an issue. And if your website doesn't load in exactly 0.5 seconds, people like throw their computer out the window. But once upon a time, it wasn't quite so fast. And it's kind of incredible how fast it, you think about it. So these data packets are in the form of a few different, we'll call them languages, I guess, for lack of a better term. But yeah, languages. HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We're going to talk about each of these, but before we do, we're going to talk about how they play into full stack web development. So that's what we're here for, right? Full stack web development. It's a fancy buzz term. I feel like they weren't even using this term a couple decades ago. It has become very popular, and a lot of people don't fully understand what it's referring to. What does it mean when you say full stack? What's a stack? Why is it full? How does that play into web development? All the questions. So full stack web development refers to the entire breadth of technologies required to power a web application. In its most simplistic definition, that's what it is. The entire breadth of technologies required to create and run a web application. Now, a web application has many components, right? There's the part that you see, right? You sign on to, I keep using Amazon as an example, Netflix. You sign into your Netflix account, right? You log in, you get the login menu, you see the accounts, you see you, your family, all your friends mooching off of your account, right? You click on, or maybe you're the moocher, I don't know. You click into your account and you see this, variety of options here all laid out to you. But the actual physical aspect that you can see, or that your client, the web browser, is pulling up and making available, that's sort of collectively referred to as the front end. So the content that you see, the design of it, the colors that you're seeing, the pictures on screen, the video montages, the fact that when you hover over the settings button, it lights up and you get a little automatic drop down without even clicking anything. Your mouse just hovers over it and you see this interaction happen. The fact that you can click on one of your mooching friends' accounts and log them right out, or change the password. That interaction that you're having with the website, all of that is like the front end of the website, right? That's what the client is able to see and interact with. But of course, there's a lot of logic powering that. There's a lot happening behind the scenes, right? So that's where we get into the back end. That's the server side of things. So this is where the logic sort of lives for how to actually power that website. This is generally written in languages like Python or Java or C#. My work uses a lot of C#, or PHP, if you're not up to speed with this decade. Just kidding, PHP is a great language, but it's not one of the industry leading languages. But, one of the, you'll hear all these different languages and it starts to feel like they're kind of mostly interchangeable. And in a lot of ways they are. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses. But at the end of the day, a back-end programming language is a back-end programming language. So things like Python and Java and C# and C++ and C, all of these are server-side languages. So the logic kind of powering the application, and the server that's delivering that ultimate response to a client, that's the back end. But of course, you have the database. You have to have some aspect that's like holding on to information storage and maintenance. That's the database. So that's when you hear terms like SQL or SQL or Microsoft SQL Server or MySQL or MongoDB, or Redis, or you'll hear SQL versus NoSQL databases. But all of these are just different ways of holding on to information. So when we say full stack, we're talking about this entire set. We're talking about the front end, right? The client-side technologies, the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The server-side logic, the back end. So your Python or your Java or your, whatever is kind of plugging into the rest of the application. And then you've got the database. So your MongoDB or your SQL database. And a full stack web developer can build a web application from the front to the back to the database and understand and build and manage all of it, right? And a lot of developers tend to be more focused towards one or the other, right? People tend to be either really strong front-end developers or really strong back-end developers, great at C# and Java, or database engineers. There's an entire industry behind just the database, right? That's huge, especially nowadays, and it's only going to get bigger. And database engineers make a lot of money. I think it's because their job is probably rough. I don't know. Every time I work in a database, I'm like, ooh, you guys deserve to get paid. And because it's so important, right? Think about it. Like, imagine what would happen to Facebook if, like, their databases, because they have many, like exploded or crashed or something. Which happens periodically. Like, you'll see like people freak out on Instagram because like Instagram goes down for 15 minutes, or like people can't log into their accounts for 15 minutes, or like crazy things happen, or they get booted off their account and their account disappears, and like people like freak the hell out, right? Because they're like on the devices 24/7. I'm saying they, like, I'm not among them, but I am. If I can't get into Amazon or Instagram, if Instagram's not loading for 5 minutes, I'm like, what the hell is this shit? Like, get it together, Instagram. But yeah, I mean, database engineers make a lot of money for good reason. So anyways, a full stack web developer, that is someone who understands every single aspect. And our job is to teach you each of those aspects so that by the end of this, you can bang out a full stack multi-page web application in just a few hours, which, by the way, most four-year computer science grads cannot do, right? If you think about a four-year degree, there's a lot that they're learning. And it's incredible. But it's not just the practical knowledge, it's the theoretical knowledge. It's the history, it's the info on how the hardware actually works. So there's a lot more to a computer science degree than web development. But the flip side of that is that they're learning this entire breadth of knowledge of this industry, and they come out with slightly different practical skills, right? Computer science grads tend to have a lot more theoretical knowledge, and they sort of have worked with SQL. They sort of have worked with maybe React, but they haven't really worked with them in depth. And if you put a bootcamp grad and a CS grad head to head and say, in the next 5 hours, build me this wireframe with that kind of a database and have all of this functionality here, I bet you the bootcamp grad will bang it out faster than the CS grad can, because a bootcamp is just about the practical skills. That's like, you are here to learn how to create an application, to learn how to manage it, to understand everything from the front to the back to the database. I'm not going over the history of languages, of like computer science languages, or like the intricacies of how C# developed from Java and how like similar and different they are, right? We're not going into all of these details. I'm like, here's HTML, here's CSS, here's JavaScript, here's how they work, here's how you build an application, here's a database, now go. It's like boom, boom, boom. But that's like at its core what the difference is between boot camps and other modes of learning, other metrics like full four-year degrees, is we just care about the practical skills. We want you out the door and in a job as quickly as possible, right? So getting more into the one aspect of full stack web development, React. What is it and why is it important? So React is a framework. And actually, okay, before I get further into this, and I will kick this off again. I see there's like convo going in the chat, which is good. But I'm curious about what people's backgrounds are. I know at least one person has dev experience. And I see someone asking about 4 months. How do you fit this in with 40 hours a week? This is a part-time boot camp to anyone who's kind of wondering. Skillspire kind of caters to the demographic of people that can't afford to take 4 months off of work, which is what you have to do if you're doing a full-time boot camp, realistically, and can't necessarily afford the cost of a 4-month full-time boot camp. Those things are really, really expensive, right? When they say they're trying to cram 16 semesters or quarters, 8 semesters worth of college work into 4 months, they give a very specific price point. So Skillspire is intended to be sort of a more affordable option, both in terms of time and money. It's not as expensive, and you can still work. So most of our students are actually like working full time. So yeah, you can absolutely work while you're doing this. Although thank you, Yasmin, for answering that question. So for everybody who is interested in this, I think you can even raise your hand in here. I don't know if you've seen that little, here, I'll do it. See, I raised my hands. You can see a little like, pop up. So let's see, whoops. Well, now I can't unraise my hands. Lower hands, there we go. Gosh, of course. So show of hands, who here actually has some level of industry experience, whether it's web development or you've worked with databases, or maybe you work in QA. That's where we actually get a lot of people. Yeah, anyone who has industry experience. Okay, and that was it Sojan? I think you were the one who mentioned you have industry experience. Where did the chat go? There's the chat. Okay, yeah, so you had said you're mid-tier database dev, and React is kind of a different beast. I agree. Okay, so just Sojan. So nobody else has industry experience. Okay, that's good to know. Because, excuse me, I flipped my computer. That just sort of gives me context in kind of what I can talk about and what I can speak to and sort of what level I can speak to it. And so Jen, you said, I don't know Python and Ruby, but everything else looks easier than React.js. React is pretty. That's how I felt when I first signed it. Okay, I can dive back into this. Thank you. So what is React and why is it important? The first question we really have to answer is, what is a framework? Because I can say React is a framework, just like Angular is a framework, just like Django is a framework, and people are like, cool, I don't know what that means. So what is a framework? A framework, again, we're thinking like simple definitions here. It's a platform for developing your software applications. What does that mean? So when you are developing a software application, and you're thinking about like the front end of it, you are building out the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. And I'm probably actually gonna jump back to the slide because I want to get a little bit into like what is HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript in order to better explain what React is. But for now, all you have to know is that when you are building a web application, it is not so different sort of from like building a house. I mean, it's very different from building a house, to clarify, because it's virtual and it requires no hard labor and it's much faster and anyone can do it. But it's sort of analogous in the sense that you have to, build out sort of the skeleton of a house. And then you have to put in all the walls and a roof. And you have to, once that's complete, you then have to paint it, right? And get it all pretty and lay down the carpet and lay down the grass on the outside and do the landscaping. And then when it actually comes time to moving in, you have to furnish it and interior design and everything, right? There's all these sort of elements to building a house. Now, imagine if instead of building it from scratch, let's say you were given two options, where one plot of land, you go there and you've got stacks of wood panels and nails and nuts and bolts and hammers. I've obviously not much experience with building houses, but I think that's the general idea, right? You've got all the material and it's all just kind of like there. And you've got this empty plot of land. And it's like, okay, go. Versus going onto a different plot of land. If you've ever done like Habitat for Humanity, which actually I have a couple times, and they've already built out the framework for you. They have laid the foundation, right? That cement sort of like plot. They have built up the skeleton of the house, and you have a literal framework for your house. It's not much. It's just the sort of, maybe the main pillars and the beams. I was like, what's the word? The beams of wood that are kind of like built out for the roof. It's very bare bones, but it's a much easier starting point than, say, building a house completely from scratch. Now you've got the foundation laid out, now you've got the framework laid out, and all you have to do is sort of like put the rest of it together. So get the rest of the panels of wood and put in the windows and paint it, make it look all pretty, right? So it's a long-winded analogy, but that's kind of how a framework works in web application development as well, right? So something like React is sort of providing you this platform or this foundation so that you can then take that and go and build your web application without necessarily having to like by hand put together all those other little pieces to put that foundation in place. So things like React and Angular and Django and Spring Framework for Java, right? Every language has numerous frameworks associated with it. That's the beauty of this. You get into coding, you want to know how to do everything by hand, how to code your HTML and your CSS and your JavaScript and everything. You still need to know it. Any full stack web developer worth their salt knows each of these languages. But when it comes to actually, in practical terms, building out your own web applications, if you're doing, a small pet project, let's say, and you're kind of making yourself an online portfolio, that's where a lot of people start. They build themselves like an online portfolio, online resume, and they, link to different things they've created or just put up their job experience and a few pictures, hobbies, whatever. It's not necessarily such a huge project to put that together. You spend a few days and you can kind of crank it out on your own without necessarily using the help of these frameworks. Now, if you think about it from an enterprise perspective, where you're not building, a 2-page web application or a single-page web application for 1 or 5 or 20 people to see, but you're building a multi-page web application that is intended to serve thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. Think about something like Facebook. Facebook is used by probably like at least a billion people, which is like way more than a million. There's a big difference between a billion and a million, right? Those 3 zeros matter a lot. Anyways, all of that is to say that when you've got applications serving, that big of an audience, and it's that complex of a website, if you told me to sit down and rebuild a version of Facebook, my version of Facebook, from scratch, and have all the same functionality, I can do it. But it's going to take a while. Now, if you tell me I can do it, but I can use React or Angular or some other framework that's going to sort of lay out a foundation for me and sort of start my application over here instead of over here, it saves a lot of time and effort, and it adds a level of structure that I wouldn't otherwise have. So that's really where these frameworks come into play. Now, that's not to say that you can't use React if you're building your own portfolio, and in fact, that's the best way to learn. If you're learning a framework, you don't want to build the most complicated web application for the first time. React does have a learning curve. All of these frameworks have learning curves. But it's often, these frameworks are often used at the enterprise level because of how much they simplify things, how much structure they add. And it's sort of like, why reinvent the wheel, right? I can hand code everything. Well, okay, it's weird to say hand code because it's not like you're not hand coding everything else, but all of that is to say I could build everything from scratch, but why do it if I don't have to, right? There's these pre-designed sets of code that give you this framework. So that's where React really comes into play. That's where all these frameworks come into play. Now that you understand what a framework is, and you'll often hear either framework or library. And you'll often hear something like, React is a lightweight framework that straddles the line between library and framework for the industry. And it's like, what does that mean? I remember like spitting that out in an interview. And they were like, wow, very good. And I had no idea what I was talking about. This is early on, long time ago. So what is a library? A library is very much like a framework, but the way I see it is that a library provides a lot of tool sets for you. A framework, when you implement it, you are sort of locked into a little bit more structure than a library is. A library is like what it sounds like. It's a giant collection of code that you can like borrow, the way you can borrow a book, right? You can say, I want to use this tool set, I want to use this tool set. Thank you. I'll come again. A framework is more like, it's a little bit more heavyweight, and it's definitely more structured. You don't get to like pick and choose as much. You still get to pick and choose. There's a whole series of tool sets available for you, but it's a little bit more enforcing of the structure behind it. Now, React specifically is a a lightweight front-end web framework, rapidly growing in popularity. When I say lightweight, if you compare it to something like Angular, which actually essentially does the same thing, Angular is also a front-end JavaScript framework. But Angular is very heavyweight. There's a lot of steps, there's a lot of components, there's a lot to understand behind this framework. Angular is almost always used for enterprise level applications. People will build smaller applications in Angular to like understand it, but it feels like you're doing a lot for a small application. For a bigger application, it absolutely makes sense. And again, when you're learning it, it makes sense to build these smaller applications. But React is more lightweight. So it doesn't have, I would say, quite as steep of a learning curve as frameworks like Angular do and other heavyweight frameworks. And it's a little bit more akin to a library in that way. It doesn't enforce quite as much intense structure on you, which is kind of nice. It's very flexible in that way. It was originally designed by Facebook, and it's used by companies all over, right? A lot of the big tech companies use it. Amazon, Instagram, Netflix, Pinterest, Shopify, Uber, Airbnb, and a lot more than that. My company is starting to use React now. It had historically used Angular, but I would say React is sort of rising in popularity at this point. It's an open source JavaScript framework. What does open source mean? Open source means that it is something that has an open code base. So it's not proprietary. If you think about applications that are not open source, think of like the Microsoft Office suite, for example, right? You have access to Microsoft Word and Microsoft PowerPoint and all these things, but you don't know the code behind them or what's generating them. And you can't go in and say, actually, I want Microsoft Word to do this thing by default, right? Like it's a proprietary piece of software. You don't get to go in and like recode certain things. Something that's open source is like open to the public. You can contribute to it. And in fact, one of the quickest ways that new devs, new developers, new bootcamp grads, recent bootcamp grads will sort of start getting some industry experience, because it's so hard in the beginning, right? That's the hardest thing, is just getting that first job. Once you get that first job, like you're in, right? But one of the ways that a lot of people will sort of get a leg up early on is they will contribute to open source software, because you can literally go in and you could create, once you understand React really in depth, you could go in and add, your own tool set to you can create your own React library. It's actually really, really cool. So the fact that it's open source means it's getting a lot of support. It's getting contributed to from people all over the world. And you can really fully understand what the code is doing is like the best part of that. And it's a JavaScript framework. So a lot of these frameworks, every framework is going to be associated with a language, but something like Angular, for example, is kind of tricky because to get Angular to work, you need to understand JavaScript and you need to understand TypeScript, which is like a superset of JavaScript. Like it works a little bit differently versus something like React. As long as you know JavaScript, if you know JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, like you'll be fine. Really, you just need to understand JavaScript in order to understand React. So that's nice that it's like, it doesn't require sort of these like extra languages that you need to learn. And it also has this component called React Native. So React Native makes app development really easy, which is why one of the reasons it's so popular. So if you think about people that are making like mobile applications, Obviously, that's really, really hot right now, and it's only going to get bigger. But of course, everybody is kind of split into these camps, right? They've either got the iPhone or they've got Android, right? The world is broken up into two kinds of people. I'm an iPhone girl. This is like an old iPhone. It's so little compared to the new ones. But if you want to make a mobile application, there's like these considerations of, well, I want it to work on iOS, but now I'm going to need to program my application in Swift because that's the language that iOS uses. But you want it to work in Android too, which means you're going to have to make the exact same thing in Java, which is like a completely different language. And it's like, God, do I really want to build the exact same application in like 3 different languages to have it on Android and iOS and on the web? It's what a lot of people have done. Now, React Native is sort of like a build once, use forever kind of idea behind it. Or I guess more specifically, learn once, build wherever. Because you can learn React once, you can learn React Native once, and now you can just build out one application and it will work. It will like figure out the sort of conversions behind the scenes for you, and you can write one application that will work in Android and iOS and on the web. And that's a really, really cool aspect. So React Native is like in particular gaining popularity just because of how easy it makes app development. And again, there is a learning curve. There's always a learning curve associated with these things, but it's not quite as steep as some of the other ones. It's a very handy framework, and I would highly recommend getting into it. Now, of course, you're not going to understand what a framework is doing if you don't understand what the languages are doing. So, web fundamentals, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We're going to get into this, and we're going to do our own little workshop. I'm going to pause here for a second. I see Sujan asked the question, Skillspire uses TypeScript for React. No. So React only requires JavaScript, so you don't need to worry about TypeScript. I also teach a full stack course using Angular, or I used to. Now we pretty much just do React. But I have taught what's called the meme stack. It's an acronym. I'm a really nice instructor, I swear. But it's an acronym that stands for MongoDB, Express JS, which is the server-side framework, also a lightweight framework. And then I used to teach the meme stack, right? So the A was Angular. N stands for Node.js. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But Angular and the meme stack, because it utilizes Angular, requires TypeScript. And so you have to know TypeScript in order to use Angular. Now we more or less teach React. So now I teach the MERN stack, and we have other MERN instructors. So you just swap out that A with the R for React. React only uses JavaScript, and that's a really nice part of it. Because whenever I had to teach the meme stack, when I had to teach Angular, it was like, we just learned HTML, we just learned CSS, we just learned JavaScript, we just learned what frameworks are. Now I'm going to teach you TypeScript. And they like, people's heads would explode because it was like, another one. But it's a superscript of JavaScript. Like, they're not like wildly different or anything, but it's another thing to learn versus with React. It's like, you just need to know JavaScript, which is kind of nice. So I'm going to pause here really quickly. Are there any questions? You can raise your hands. We can actually talk. That's always nice. This is a very quiet group. It's almost like unnerving.
I'm actually enjoying every moment with you. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm glad.
Yeah, I'm already learning a lot. So yeah.
Awesome. Feedback is always great. Okay, wonderful. I'm glad to hear it. And are there any questions about anything we've gone over, or the boot camp itself, or what I had for breakfast? I'm just kidding. You want me to ask what I had for breakfast? Okay, so it doesn't sound like there's a ton of questions. I do want to give people a couple minutes in case people need to like run to the restroom, get a coffee refill, what have you. So why don't we take like the next 3 minutes or so, 3 to 5 minutes. And I'll just give people a second in case people need to run out. This is usually when I hang out and answer questions. but I'll give you guys a second. And then at 11:10, we can come back and start talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, go over kind of our own little workshop, and then leave maybe like, let's say 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the end to kind of go over questions. I expect there will be questions in the second half because that's when we're actually going over code. Okay, well, take a couple minutes, make your bathroom stops and your coffee runs and all that jazz, and I will check back in 2 minutes. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you guys got all your assessments, did all the bathroom breaks. We're gonna power through for the next 47 minutes and go over some HTML and CSS and a teeny tiny bit of JavaScript. Okay, so I'm gonna play this PowerPoint, but I'm gonna be hopping in and out of it because you are gonna be actually coding. So if you haven't already, boot up your text editors, or by that I mean just open the application, because we are going to be doing some actual coding. And I'll bring mine up as well. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between them. So like this is what Visual Studio Code looks like with an actual application open. This is an HTML application. But I have all three as well. So this is Visual Studio Code. I've got Atom. Please note, if you download Visual Studio instead of Visual Studio Code, that is different, right? So Visual Studio is what's called an IDE, or an integrated development environment. It's like a full-fledged IDE versus Visual Studio Code, little baby text editor, much more simplistic, not as much going on. I mean, you can still do everything that we're doing in Visual Studio Code. You can do it in Visual Studio. You can do that and then some, but it's got way more tooling and we don't actually need all of that. So make sure you downloaded Visual Studio Code. And this is what Atom looks like, right? So this is like what the welcome screen looks like when you first open it up. I don't have any applications open on it, so it doesn't look quite as scary. A hackable text editor for the 21st century. I actually love Atom. I love the overall design of it. I love the colors that it utilizes. I'm saying that as it's all like in black and white right now. But if I were to actually open up an application on this, you'll see what I'm talking about. But Visual Studio Code, Atom, Sublime, they all achieve the same thing. I don't really care which one you open. I'll be using, I think, Visual Studio Code because that's what I always use. And I'll talk about like, you know, kind of the differences between them, why I prefer one over the other. So anyways, if you haven't already, go ahead and power up that application and just have it like ready to go because we're going to do a little coding. Okay, so the web fundamentals. Anytime you are taking one of our full stack courses, so if you're taking full stack with Mern, right, and you're learning React or Mean, or you're taking the Python stack, whichever one you're taking, we always start with the web fundamentals. So when I originally talked about that sort of like request response cycle that happens where the server will send back a response, you'll send a request, not you, but your client will send a request, the web browser will, you know, request a web page, and that response gets sent back in the form of data packets. These data packets come in the form of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So these are the sort of fundamental languages that make up the web. 99.999% of what you see on the internet is powered by HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML and CSS are involved in everything that you see on the internet. JavaScript is involved in like literally 99.99%. Some people will use things outside of JavaScript, but like pretty much everyone uses JavaScript. So what do they actually all do and how do they work together? Over here, I use my human analogy, but I'm actually going to jump back to my house analogy at some point because I think that might actually be more applicable. But either way, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. These are all acronyms. The industry loves acronyms. There's acronyms all over the damn place. You will get to know each and every one of them the more you get into this industry, but right off the bat, it feels a little weird. And honestly, a lot of times if you quiz developers on these acronyms, half the time they don't even know. Most people know at least what like HTML and CSS stand for, but like I've been quizzed by people on like certain acronyms and suddenly realized like, I don't know, I've been calling it by its short form for so long. I have no idea what the long form even is. So if you want to be able to show off your talents, it's nice to know what these acronyms actually stand for. So HTML, Hypertext Markup Language. It is a language that allows you to put out content. That's really what it is. It's content and it's structure for your web application. So when you look at something like, okay, let's just pretend for a second that what you're staring at is not a PowerPoint slide, but is in fact a page of a website, which like it could be, or at least a chunk of a page, right? A little bare bones, but it's got some things going on. If you were to think of this as something like a static web page that has been built with HTML and CSS, the part that HTML would control, is my mouse going to show up on this thing? No, is the words that you're seeing on the page. So the part that actually says the web fundamentals, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The words that you're seeing, the fact that it's a bullet point sort of drop, a bullet point list, the fact that there's a picture off to the side, the fact that there's sort of a differentiation of types of text. You've got like what looks like kind of a title, like a header that says HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then you've got this sort of smaller subtext that's more like classic paragraph style text, but in the form of a bullet point list. All of that would be dictated by HTML. So hypertext markup language is the language that allows you to add content to a web page and give it some amount of structure and sort of control the overall layout. Now, CSS, or cascading style sheet, is the styling of all of that, right? So if you're thinking about, again, pretending this is like sort of a static web page, CSS would be dictating the colors that you're seeing, the font that you're seeing, the size of the words that you're seeing, the placement of things, the fact that the picture is off to the right and the text is off to the left, the fact that those little bullet points are cute little blue triangles instead of black circles. All of that is dictated by CSS. So CSS handles the look and feel and styling of the overall web page. So when we when we think about this like sort of human analogy, if you thought of us as web applications, which is kind of a freaky dystopian way of looking at things, very Blade Runner, but if we were just a program walking around, the HTML could be thought of as sort of the initial structure, right? My bones, maybe even my muscles, my tendons, my ligaments, the like guts, the stuff that's inside, the stuff that makes me a human. CSS would be the aesthetics. So the things that I can change, like my hair color, my hairstyle, my eye color, which you can change with color contacts, my clothes. Am I more like sporty style? Am I more business casual chic, right? CSS is like the styling of everything. Now, JavaScript adds some logic into play. So it is the ability to actually interact as a user with a website. So when I was talking about things like hovering over a link and it lighting up, right? So that you get that sort of interaction, you get that response that says, okay, the web page is acknowledging that my mouse was hovering over it and I know it's a clickable link because it just lit up and underlined the word. And that's that sort of like response that a user needs that says, okay, this is a link. Because you don't even think about these things, right? They just like sort of happen and you don't question them on the web. Usually, unless you're like a developer or programmer and you're like critiquing how they're doing it. You're like, I would have added the underline, they didn't add the underline, right? That's always fun. Like you start working as a programmer and now I go on websites and I'm like, you're getting an HTML error. You really need to work on your security there, right? Like it's just like fun. But anyways, if you're like a normal person who's not doing all of that, you don't question any of that. But if you think about it, imagine if you hovered over, the settings button on your Netflix account and like nothing happened, right? No light up, no underline, no change, no bolding of the font. You just hover over it and absolutely nothing happens. You might know it's a link because it should be a link, but that like little bit of interaction gives you the necessary feedback so that you as a user are like, oh, that's a link. That's where I click. I should click on it. Maybe it goes a step further and not only lights it up, but provides a little drop-down menu. And now you can see the options. And as you sort of hover through the drop-down menu, each one kind of lights up as you're going. All of these interactions are powered by JavaScript, right? So JavaScript powers that sort of like functionality of the actual web features that you're interacting with. So JavaScript, if we go back to our person analogy, is the the neurons and the nerves and the things that allow me to actually like do things as a person. The fact that I can speak and I can have a conversation with someone, the fact that I can run around, all of that is like JavaScript, right? The brains really is actually, I think that's what that's supposed to be. The brains and like the nerves that kind of stem out of that. So anyways, I actually will retract what I said earlier. I think a person is a good analogy because houses do also do things, sort of. But, when you think of a person, you can think of like the actual like actions and the interactions that might happen. So anyways, that's our analogy. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript collectively allow you to power a web application. Now, if you were to take JavaScript out of the mix and you just have HTML and CSS, you would have something like what you're looking at right now, which is called a static web page, as opposed to a dynamic web page. A dynamic web page is something that you can interact with, that you as a user, you can click on things, you can submit a form, you can click on different links and actually like interact with the web page. A static web page is sort of like just like a picture, right? You're just seeing this content. Yes, there is content. Yes, there's a certain style to it. There's a clear structure, but it's static. Nothing's actually happening. With just HTML and CSS, you can create a static web page. So getting into HTML. What is the point of HTML? What do we actually use it for? Again, it's used to communicate the content and the structure of the web page using markup language. Markup is a language. Hypertext markup language is just one subset of markup language. There's actually there's like XML, which is another type of markup language. But HTML is like what sort of you see all over the internet. And it's used to sort of add this content and this structure to pretty much all web pages. It uses what are called elements. So these last 3 points are going to make a lot more sense as we're actually coding. So why don't we actually start doing that? So again, if you haven't already, boot up your applications. Which one do I feel like using? I always use Visual Studio Code. So just to give you a very little bit of background on these different text editors. Again, they all accomplish the same thing. Anything that you can do with Atom, you can do with Sublime, you can do with Visual Studio Code. So there isn't any like significant difference, especially for your stage, like for where you're at, like just starting to learn coding, or maybe you're already a mid-tier developer, actually, so maybe then it does matter. They essentially accomplish the same things. I will say one difference that most people have noted. So Visual Studio Code was developed by Microsoft as part of their Visual Studio Suite. It pairs very nicely with C#, which is the language that they developed. And if you are living in Seattle, which I don't think all of you are, because at least some people were sort of on the Central Time, maybe even Eastern Time. But if you are living in the Pacific Northwest, particularly if you live in Seattle, you live in Microsoft country. C# is big here. And if you go to any tech job in Seattle, a lot of them use C# and a lot of them use Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. The last 2 programming jobs I've had both use C# and Visual Studio. So it's very popular in this area. I think really the biggest difference is that Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code have the best debuggers. And a debugger is like a program built into this thing that will let you like run an application and actually like when something is breaking, you can set up what are called breakpoints. So I can do this. These are breakpoints. So when I'm running through the application, it might hit this line if it has a breakpoint and say, what would you like to do? And it will let you like step through the code one by one. Anyways, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but open up your text editor of choice and we'll do a couple things. You know what? I'm going to change things up and I'm going to use Atom for a second because I just haven't used Atom in so long. And I actually really like it. And I always use Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code because I use it for work. So let's try this. I'm going to exit out of the welcome screen. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Is that still here? No. Okay, never mind. I was going to show you a couple of things. There's a few things that you can do. The welcome guide will kind of like take you through a few things, but you can actually ignore a lot of it. You can choose a theme if you want. There's different themes. That's just like you're choosing the like look of your particular text editor. Or you can open a project, and you can open a folder tree. So I'll show you what this actually looks like. So I'm gonna just open up a new file, which also you can just do with, if you're on a Mac, Command N, right? If you're on a Windows, Control N. Also, keyboard like shortcuts. So the hotkeys, keyboard shortcuts, so important in programming. Like, you don't generally see programmers that do like, you know, file, new file, and like all of these things. I'm going to kind of do it. I'm going to do it so you guys can see what I'm doing so that you're not like trying to play catch up as I like power through a bunch of hotkeys. But as you get more deeply into this, you're definitely going to want to learn what all those hotkeys are so that you can look like a fancy, cool developer yourself. All right, so I just opened up a new file, right? There's nothing in this one. I'm not opening up a pre-existing one. If you do want to open up a pre-existing one, you can do what's called add project folder. And I'll actually go ahead and do this because I'm going to save everything into here. So I can go through and find like a particular folder that I want to add. So like I have my SkillsFire folder, and I'll just add my workshops folder into this. And I can already see the things that I have saved in here. And I'll save this next one in here too. So I'm going to go ahead. The first thing I'm going to do is save my file, which, okay, well, I'm not going to do a file save on that. Basically, if you're on a Mac, do a Command S, that'll save. If you're on a Windows, Control S, that'll automatically save, or automatically open up this window so that you can save it. Most people know these, and sometimes when I explain, like, oh, you do Command S to save, people are like, why are you explaining this to me? Like, it's not my first time on a computer. So if you do already know that, I apologize, but a lot of people actually don't when they're getting into this. So I will say also, okay, this is actually a good time to make this point. If you are serious about pursuing coding or web development or, you know, in any capacity, any of this, and also this is something that I didn't highlight so much earlier, but I meant to. When you get into, when you're pursuing something like a boot camp, I think one of the coolest aspects of this is that you are not really restricted to becoming just like a software engineer or like a web developer. Yes, you are in a web development boot camp. It would make sense that you're now pursuing web development after it. But I, for example, wasn't too keen on that. I love coding. I think it's fun. I think it's challenging. It's exciting. It works creative parts of my brain that I don't get to use often. It's a really interesting challenge, and there's next to no limitations on what you can do. That is the craziest thing about it. If I just went out one day and I was like, I want to build a house, I would probably not do it because that's a lot of work and material, and I don't have the skill set for it. And even if someone taught me how to build a house, going out and building a house is a whole other thing. But if I decide I want to go out and build a web application and have it do some crazy things, I'm not worried about the laws of physics or like the materials I need to buy, like me and my computer and the internet, and I can make whatever I want, right? And that's just kind of a crazy concept to me. It still kind of blows my mind. And the first time that you put together a working web application and you can look at it and say like, I built that from scratch, just me, my brain, this keyboard, like I put that together. It's just the coolest feeling. Very gratifying. Anyways, as much as I loved that, I actually didn't love working as a programmer. And that is purely a personality thing. I love working with people, in case you couldn't tell. I love interacting with people. I love collaborating with people. yeah, that's just like a big aspect of my personality. So as much as I love coding, working head down, like 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, not really like interacting with other people that much and just like working on my program. It was gratifying in many ways, but I also really missed the like interaction with my peers. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people love that. My brother loves that. He loves just working head down and like working on his application and not really getting bothered by meetings and by people. And, it's like he has totally the personality for it. And that's how a lot of people are. So if you like that, you are in the right industry. Absolutely. But if you don't like that, you're still in the right industry. That's the best part. I went on to become basically a technical PM. So now I project manage other people's tasks. I just hand other people work to do and tell them when their deliverables are and like bug them about getting their work done and manage the overall sort of project timeline, and also have to do some coding and some debugging. And that's the best thing is like, if there are technical PMs and there are non-technical, there are PMs out there who have not gotten a degree or not gotten a boot camp certification, what have you. And there's a clear difference between PMs that understand the work that they're assigning to the devs and don't understand the work that they're assigning to the devs. And there is nothing worse than working for a boss who hands you a bunch of stuff to do and is like, so can you get this done in the next like 25 developer hours? And you're like, no, I can't. Like, this is not, I don't know. I've never worked on this application before. Or like, we hit an error at hour 20 that took 8 hours to debug or whatever. Like, working with someone who actually understands the work that's being put in, it makes a big difference. And if you decide to, pursue this industry and then you decide like, no, I don't want to necessarily be a programmer, that's fine. There's so many other directions you can go in, right? You can become a web developer, a software engineer. You can become a solutions engineer. You can become a project engineer. You don't have to be an engineer of any sort. You can just, you can be a project manager or program manager or a product owner, right? You can be a PO. There's just a lot of directions, that you can go in. And that was kind of one of the other fascinating aspects of this industry for me. Anywho, I don't actually remember where I was going with that other than there's a lot of different tracks that you can take within this industry. Okay. So you're at the point where you've just opened up a file and you haven't actually done anything with it, presumably. If you haven't already, start a new file and we're just going to save it. And we are just going to call this, if you will type, basic HTML intro. Now, you will notice a couple things. One, I am doing this all in one giant word, right? I'm not doing basic HTML intro. I'm not doing that. Don't do that. It's generally a bad habit, and I'll explain why. And if you do want the sort of like spacing without the space, you can give it an underscore. You can say basic HTML intro with some underscores. You can do what's called camel casing. So you capitalize the first letter of each subsequent word. Camel casing or Pascal casing? I think Pascal is if I were to capitalize the very first one also. I'm not going to do that. So I like camel casing a lot. That's kind of my go-to. Basic HTML intro. .html. If you are on a Mac, give it a .html. If you are on a Windows, I believe you leave that blank and somewhere down here it will say file type. And it's probably defaulted to like basic text file or something. Click on that and select HTML. Now what you don't want to do is type in blah, 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 .html and also additionally select, that was so redundant, and also additionally so many, okay, anyways, you don't want to do .html and select file type HTML because then you wind up with blah, 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 .html, which is like always goofy, very fixable, but like silly. So don't do that. So if you're on a Mac, xyz.html. I just called it basic HTML intro.html. If you're on a Windows, leave that part blank. I mean, say basic HTML intro, no file extension, and just select the file type. That file extension matters. It dictates how your text editor is going to interpret this file. So note now that as I'm typing, ooh, things are happening, right? Because it's a text editor and it's predicting my text, which is why it's so much better than like Notepad or something like that, well, for a number of reasons. But if you recall, if I just have a random file and I haven't saved it, nothing's happening, right? It's not predicting anything because it doesn't know how to interpret it. It's just interpreting it as basic text. Here, because I gave it a .html extension, it's like, oh, you're typing in HTML. So I'm going to type HTML. I'm going to tab over, right? I literally just, again, started typing in HTML, tab over. And I think you can hit enter too. Yeah. So there's a few different things going on here, right? Off the bat, we see we've got a doc type HTML. This is always the first line in an HTML document. That's always the thing you see at the top. And that is sort of like your HTML declaration. That is now when I put this into a web browser and have the web browser actually like run through this HTML file, it sees that declaration at the top and immediately understands, okay, I need to ingest this as an HTML file, not CSS, not JavaScript, not Python, HTML, because it has this declaration. Technically speaking, you could delete this declaration, and as long as it has the file extension of .html, it'll probably be fine. But it's sort of browser dependent, it's application dependent. In general, it's like standard. You keep this guy. It's literally saying document type HTML. Now you'll notice these sort of little things. You've got these little carets on the side. You've got these like slashes. You've got title, caret, slash, title. Every language has its own syntax. Syntax refers to sort of the specifics of how the language is written out, right? So the syntax of English is going to be different from the syntax of French. French has like accents that English doesn't have. They use the same alphabet, right? French, English, and Spanish all use the same alphabet, but they all have very different syntax. They have very different like grammatical rules, right? So computer languages are sort of the same in that vein. They're all using the same like set of keys, but the syntax specifics are quite different from language to language. So you'll see CSS looks very different from HTML, which looks very different from JavaScript. They all look very different from each other. And so do all the other languages, right? So like Python, C#, Java, Ruby, PHP, they all look very different. They all have their own syntactical rules that dictate how that language is intended to be written. And there's a few sort of standard rules that we like to follow. Every program reads from top to bottom, left to right. I guess you guys are seeing me in reverse, so top to bottom, left to right. But you don't have programs like reading from the bottom up. It starts at the top. The first thing your program interprets, or the first thing the browser is going to interpret, is this doc type HTML. The next thing it's going to interpret is this line here that is specifying that the language is in English. That's what that EN is. You can change that to other things, and you can type in other languages, right? You have to do more than just like change that lang English, but you can change this and you can change what language it's expected to interpret in, right? It's not actually like reading through and like, doing things with the content you write, but something like title obviously is like different in a different language. Anyways, it's reading from top to bottom, left to right. So the next thing that it sees is this head piece right here, right? Head, body. So going back to this guy right over here, HTML uses tags to define content type. Title is paragraph text, links, lists, tables, etc., etc. Tags are not displayed. They simply allow the browser to interpret what type of content it is and render it correctly. Very true. So what does all of that mean? Something like this, where you see head or where you see body, this right here, this is an element. This is called the body element. It's got this little caret, body caret, and then this close caret, body caret. That little slashy thing makes it like a closer. because it is allowing the browser to understand this is where the actual body of the text is. This is where I'm actually going to be putting in the important information. So if I was making, let's say, like a personal website, I could say, welcome to my website. My name is Sonia Ahmed, and I am a full stack web developer in Seattle, right? So I can do this. Now, this is a pretty bare bones web page, as we're seeing, right? But let's go ahead and take a look. Oh, rats, I can't do that from here. Okay, so if you are in Visual Studio Code, I'm just going to show you this really quick. You can do things like, I think this is just a built-in feature. You can right-click on a tab and you can say open in default browser or open other browsers. Super handy because otherwise, really, it won't let me do it. It's so stupid. Okay, there's probably an extension I can download, but that's fine because anyways, you guys should see like how to do it without that handy-dandy extension. So you're going to take this file and you are going to literally drop it into your web browser. So you're going to drag and drop, right? So I'm going to click here, hold, pull into my preferred web browser, which at the moment is Google Chrome, and drop it in. And now you see this. Welcome to my website. My name is Sonia Ahmed, and I'm a full stack web developer in Seattle. You just made a website. Kind of, not exactly. You didn't really just make a website. What you did is you put together a static HTML file and dropped it into a web browser where your web browser is interpreting it as the HTML file that it is and displaying the content as you've dictated it to do. So
I have a question, Samia.
yes.
Did you have to save it and then refresh so you can pass it to the browser, or every time you update it, you have to save and then refresh?
Great question. Fantastic question, because I did not mention that. You do need to save it. I'm pretty sure I have autosave on. Actually, do I? No, I don't. Okay, so I just made this change. Wait, bad change. Ignore that change. Let's make a different change. Welcome to my website. My name is Samia. Blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I have a pet dog, and she is real cute. She is real cute. Her name is Katara. I'll post a picture in here, maybe. Anywho, I've just made this change. You can see that this little blue dot popped up, right? I've made the change. I have not saved it yet, which is why that blue dot is there. On Atom, I don't remember how Sublime lets you know, but almost all of them let you know that you have not saved it via something like this, like a little dot. Visual Studio Code, I think, also does a dot. I think they all do a dot. Now, on Visual Studio Code, I have autosave on. What that means is every time I'm making a change, it's just like automatically saving. It's like Google Docs or something, right? Like auto-saving like every few seconds. So in Visual Studio Code, you can do File, and you see this autosave with a check mark. If I take that off, and over here I make a change, yeah, you see this like gray dot that pops up. I'm gonna go ahead and remove that change because it's a silly one. Now I made this change, I didn't save it. I go back to my web browser. I do a hard refresh, so that would be a Command-Shift-R. I don't know if you can tell, but it just refreshed it. And it doesn't look any different. It says the exact same thing. It's not updating my change. What's going on? This is one of the most common errors that people hit. It feels goofy to even call it an error because it's literally just you didn't save your document, which, by the way, is why I turned autosave on because I did not want to deal with this. That's not what I meant to do. If I do a save, so Command S, as you can see, the blue dot goes away. Now I do a hard refresh, and I see this right here. I have a pet dog, and she's real cute. Now, a couple things to know. One, it will not correctly refresh until it will not reflect the information that you added until you actually save that information. Makes sense. Thing number two, as you can see, I put this on the next line, right? I put one line here, then I hit enter, and I put another line here. Let's say I add a bunch of spaces. Show of hands. who thinks that there's two options that might happen. It will either add some space in here or it will not. So let's see. Who thinks it will add a space? Show of hands. I see no hands. I assume you know how the hand button clicky thingy works. Okay, show of hands if you think it won't add a space.
It won't.
Won't add a space. All right, we got 2 votes. We got a few people abstaining. So John, I feel like you know the answer. Are you just trying to not give it away? So you're already a developer. That's okay. For those of you who voted that it will not show a space, you are correct. It absolutely does not matter. HTML does not care about the spaces that you are adding in here, right? And that's one thing to note, is that when you want to change the actual structure, there are other ways of doing it, but it's not about adding spaces here. So if I want to actually add a space, let's say I want this to come down to the next line. Well, technically I shouldn't just be typing all willy-nilly. I should be using the different elements that HTML provides. So something like this is a body element. An element is like a piece of content that has a very specific sort of style to it. So like body is going to be one thing, head is going to be something different, title is going to be something different. Within body, though, you have a lot of different elements. This, by the way, is a tag. This is a body tag. This is an opening tag. This is a closing tag. As you can see, when I click on one, the whole pair sort of like lights up, it underlines. And that's to kind of make it nice and clear, because you can actually have a lot of tags in here and it can get confusing. You're only going to have one body tag and one head tag, though. Within the body, I have a few different things. So you can see that there's different sort of content types. There's titles, paragraphs, links, lists, all that sort of things. In the next slide, I actually show like the sort of most commonly used tags, right? You've got the headings, you've got paragraphs, images. So I'll just show you a couple here. Let's say that I want a clear header, right? I can use like an H1, right? This is heading 1. And I could say, welcome to my website, and drop it in there. Do that. Okay. I'm just going to XU, throw it in here, right? And let's say I want a slightly smaller heading. Let's give it an H3 for this guy. And I'm just cutting it and pasting it into here. Oops. Okay. And then we've got this piece hanging out right here, which I will do something with in a second. If we jump back to here and I refresh, now you can see that the content looks a little bit different. Before, it was just plain text paragraphs, right? That's what this guy is. This guy, if you don't give it any sort of like specific tag, this is what it looks like. If you actually define the tag and say, no, I want this to be an H1 or a header 1, that's the biggest and the baddest of all. That's like big, bold, like this is my header. H3, a little bit smaller. Unsurprisingly, there's also an H2. What else can I say? I don't know. Heading 2. There's an H3. There's an H4. We can put in this guy. Although I don't know that announcing you a dog would necessarily go into the header category. You'll also notice I'm cleaning this up. Like, I don't want this guy kind of like hanging out over here and this guy hanging out over here and this guy like tabbed over to here. I can make this all like wacky looking. I could, right? This just looks ugly. Ugh. And I can do this and it looks fine, right? So HTML is sort of loosey-goosey like that. It doesn't like hold you very strictly to correct formatting standards. You should always format it correctly though. And there is an auto format option, which I think is Alt-Shift-F. That's not it. Command-Shift-F. That's not it either. Control-Shift-F. Okay, well, it's different in Atom than it is in Visual Studio Code, because that would have worked. One of those would work in Visual Studio Code. Do we have like a view? Edit? No? Okay. There's totally an auto format. Also, huge part of programming, Atom auto format, is Googling stuff. It sounds ridiculous. Atom does not have a built-in command for formatting HTML. Lame. Okay, so you have to download a package. Okay, well, I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to undo all the goofiness that I did. What was I going to say? Yes, Googling things. I swear to God, that's a huge part of the job. Everyone thinks that, like, I remember the first time I asked my instructor a question like, how do you do, this in a language? And he was like, I don't know, let me Google it. And I was like, oh, you don't know. You're a professional. I was so shocked. And then I rapidly discovered that industry professionals are constantly Googling things. The thing about this industry is that it is constantly changing. It is constantly changing. It is constantly at the tip of innovation. Every language that you learn goes through these sort of like reformatting and refreshings, and old tools are deprecated and new ones come up, especially with these open source ones, but really with any of them. And you have to be constantly learning. For me, that's one of the most exciting aspects of it. I love that I'm constantly learning. I love that there's constantly new things going on in this industry, and I think that's really exciting. But you do have to stay on top of it. And you aren't always going to know what the next thing is, or you're going to learn a new language and you're not going to know anything about it. When I started my last job, not the current one that I'm current in, but the one I was in previously, it was a C# developer job. I didn't know C#. And I was very honest about that in the interview. They were like, how are your programming skills? And I was like, I'm a good programmer. I know Java, I know Python, I know, yada, yada. I don't know C#. And they're like, that's okay, you'll learn. Just Google it. And that's exactly what happened. It was day one. They were like, here are your tasks. Here's sort of how you do this thing. Good luck. Let us know if you have questions. Bye. And just kind of left me to my devices. And I just had to Google a lot of things. And that's a big aspect in coding, whether you're learning in a boot camp or I think even in college, is they expect you to be self-sufficient. So if you hit a question, you hit an error that you've never seen before, you don't know what to do, your instinct is to pop up a hand and say, hey, I don't know what's going on, somebody help me. But you get into the industry and you realize that that's not an option. You can't just shoot your hand up and ask your boss a question every 10 minutes because your boss is very busy doing their own things. You have to get good at Googling. It sounds weird, but it's an actual skill. So anyways, that whole spiel was to let you know that I didn't know how to auto-format in Atom because you can't auto-format in Atom. But anyways, HTML doesn't care a ton about that aspect of the format. It does care about these opening and closing tags, though. This dictates what's inside. Below here, I can have a paragraph text. Now, before you saw that when I split things up into 2 lines in HTML, it didn't really care until I gave each line its own opening and closing tag. And that's how it works. If I want these 2 paragraphs down here, so paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, the only way they're going to actually show up as separate paragraphs is if I put them in their own individual opening and closing brackets. And I use the P tag because P stands for paragraph. So each of these tags sort of dictate how the content is going to be interpreted. There's a lot of other ones. There's also lists, like ordered lists and unordered lists. So I could have a header that says my favorite languages. And I can have an ordered list, which means it's going to be a numbered list. And I could say, actually, I won't do the list items just yet. I'll just say, okay, Python, C#, and then Java. That's pretty much an order of preference right here. Now, if I do this, it's all going to be clunked together in one line, right? Because I didn't do any sort of differentiation here. I didn't give them their own tags. If I do something like I define list item, and then I put these guys in, and I give each one its own list item line, now they will be in their own lines.
Tommy, I have a question. When I have an opening tag and I have a sentence in the middle, I'm having 2 closing tags at the end for some reason.
So sometimes if you move things around, let's see, when does this happen? If I just try and type in like H4, like sometimes this will occasionally happen. Like if you were like cutting and pasting stuff or whatever, it'll try and auto predict, and it might think like, oh, you need a closing tag and you already need one. At that point, you can just kind of erase it. And this is where auto formatting comes in handy, because you can figure out, that's also where this like underlining tactic comes in handy. Because if I highlight this, or I highlight this, I can see there's no blue underline. There's no like hair with this. Versus if I click on this guy, like I can immediately see that pairing. So there's actually other ways to handle sort of finding all of those mismatches really quickly. If I just do this, now you can see it's a nice ordered list, right? There's also like UL unordered list, but there's a whole bunch of these. There's like many tags. I know a lot of people probably need to leave because it is 12 o'clock, or 12 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. We will be uploading the video, so I will, or Yasmin, someone will reach out to you guys. Oh, sorry, Faze. Faze will be sending out the recording link. So he's sort of like head of marketing at Skillspire. So he'll send out this recording link. So if anyone needs to dip out at this time, you can. But anyways, that was a very brief introduction into what HTML is. There's so much more that it does. And really quickly, I just wanted to show you guys something like this guy. So this is like, if you just go into it, and actually I'll just come in here and show you basic HTML and CSS templates, there's a lot to play around with. So I wanted to show you a couple of resources over here. And I just want to get this on the screen so that it gets caught in the recording. But these are some of my favorite resources. Once you get into coding, you're kind of, you know, testing out your own programs and, you know, looking things up and trying to, you know, test out how well your programs are working. Something like W3 Schools is a really great resource that has a lot of content on HTML, CSS, JavaScript. There's an HTML validator, and if you type in this URL, you can drop your HTML code in. You can either upload a file, or you can like just copy and paste the actual physical code in, and it will validate it. So it'll run through and point out like every mistake, every like error, and every warning. So it'll be an error if you're like missing a closing tag entirely. It'll be a warning maybe if you've got 2 closing tags and you're only supposed to have 1. So it'll literally like point out everything that's wrong, which is really nice. Stack Overflow, my #1 favorite resource. Anytime you hit an error when you're coding and you're like, I don't know what's going on because this thing happened, somebody somewhere in the world has experienced almost that exact same error, if not that exact same error. They've gone on Stack Overflow, they've asked the question, and somebody else has answered it. So that's definitely one of my favorite tools. Like if I were to say how to add a link, type link in HTML. And I'm like, I don't understand how to do this. Immediately, you see W3 Schools will give a really solid explanation. Let's see, that might be too basic of a question for Stack Overflow. But let's see if somebody answered it. Stack Overflow, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, how to add a hyperlink to content. You can scroll through and no green check mark. Okay, let's add a more complicated question. How to, you can see my previous searches. How to, I don't know, add a React component. Let's see. Still too general? I just want to show you what the green check mark is. There we go. So you're scrolling through and you're like, I've asked this question. This person has the exact same question. Go down, find the green check mark. This is a verified answer. This is like someone went through, tested it, and it is verified. This is the correct answer to that question. So yeah, Stack Overflow, great resource. You can create an account, but you don't have to. Like, you have to create an account if you want to ask your own question. But if you're just going through the list of questions, then somebody else has already asked it. Again, if you want to look at sort of commonly used tags, I have this list here, but W3 Schools has a much more extensive list. So rather than squeeze in 1,000 things right at the ends, I had some stuff on like what is CSS and like algorithms and whatnot. I'll stop it here and say, you know, there's so much more to see. 2 hours is a short amount of time, but we, I think, crammed a lot in, and you guys have been great, so thank you. I'll hang out for just a couple more minutes and just say, are there any questions? Do you guys have any questions about the bootcamp itself, or my industry experience, or HTML? Any of the questions?
I have a question, Samia. So once you refresh your browser, how do you go back? I mean, I know it's saved somewhere. It's saved either on a desktop or on a folder, and then do you just how do you go back to your atom file? I know this is sorry, a basic question, but how do you go back to it? Where do you save the atom file itself?
So the atom file, so this, I mean, you see it in here, but let's say, you know, you click out and you're like, oh my God, where did my project go? Of course, I added my project folder, so I can see it in here, but you can always open, and if you do like reopen project, it'll have kind of like the most recent stuff that you've worked on, which in your case is probably like the only thing. So you can either do reopen last project or reopen project. You can reopen last item, and that'll pop open whatever you were just working on. You can also go through and say what I did before, which is add a project folder. So I can do this, and I can go back to the original folder that I saved that file in, and I can say, okay, this is the folder that I want to add. Maybe I want to add my entire Skillspire folder. So I do that, and now on this left side, on this panel, on this dropdown, I can see like, there's the thing that I was just working on. Here's like the other pieces. This was like more stuff I was going to show you. 2 hours was a little ambitious. But yeah, does that answer your question about how to
Yes.
kind of access the file?
Yes. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions about anything at all? Global warming, whatever. We can talk. No. Okay. Well, if no one has any questions, of course, you can always reach out later. I'll go ahead and drop my email in here in case you want to reach out. So that's my first name dot last name 91 at gmail.com. So I'll throw that in there. If you guys have any questions, reach out. If you want to add me on LinkedIn, feel free to do so. And really, if you have any questions about like what is it like to pivot into this industry, because it's not an easy path, but it's so worth it. Joining my boot camp, I mean, it sounds crazy, but it's like one of the best decisions I think I ever made like in my life, because it just opened up a whole world for me. And in my case, I was like not tech savvy at all. It's really, for the people who've like known me since I was a kid, the fact that I'm a programmer is almost like funny to them, because I was the person that technology would like break around, and I never understood what happened. Technology still very much breaks around me all the time, but I'm a developer and I know how to fix it. So anyways, it's definitely, I think, a great path to go down, whether or not this is the industry that you think is like ultimately, you know, where you want to be. I think it's worth learning for anyone. I think everyone should learn how to code. Everyone should understand how the internet works. Everyone should understand what powers, you know, such a huge, huge part of our world. And I hope you have a good experience getting into this industry. So I think I'll wrap it up there. Of course, again, if you have any questions, you know, message in the meetup group or shoot me an email, and just like let me know, you know, hey, I attended your React workshop and just had a question about XYZ. And yeah, we can chat anytime. So if there's nothing else, I will let you guys go. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening. I hope you got something out of it. And I hope we see you guys again. I hope we see you back at SkillsFire. There's a lot more boot camps like that. I mean, there's a lot more workshops like this. There's other free workshops. There's like a full HTML CSS workshop where I just go over HTML and CSS and don't do as much like industry talk. So yeah, reach out to Yasmin, reach out to Faiz. They'll be able to tell you about other workshops as well. All right, guys. Well, I hope you have a beautiful weekend. And hit me up if you have any questions.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Samia. Thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. All right, take care, guys. Oh, I should stop recording. Oops.